All places are the same unless your mind changes. There's no magic place to get your mind right. If you feel like shit, everything you see looks like shit. In Stephen King's sprawling body of work, the novels published under the Richard Bachman pseudonym, they occupy a distinct shadow territory. While King's primary canon is frequently characterized by the intrusion of the supernatural into the domestic, the Bachman books are defined by a sort of grinding naturalism. They're books about the horror of the human condition, and they're mostly stripped of magical intervention. Among these books is Roadwork. Published in 1981, but written earlier, this novel stands as perhaps the most misunderstood entry in the series. Now, personally, I'm a bit indifferent to Roadwork, and I think it's in part due to how it's presented. On one hand, there's a real lack of momentum, and we're stuck with an unlikable protagonist. There's a genuine argument to be made that nothing really happens throughout the book. If you're coming to Roadwork expecting the kinetic dystopia of The Running Man, or the gruesome body horror of Thinner, you might be left baffled by Roadwork's focus on municipal zoning, real estate negotiations, and the internal monologue of a grieving middle-aged man. But then, on the other hand, if you stop looking at Roadwork as a thriller, the way it's billed, and you realize it's a tragedy, you come away with an altogether better experience. Roadwork feels like a piece of American naturalism, which you might remember from high school English classes. It's the plays of Arthur Miller or the novels of Theodore Dreiser. They explore the crushing weight of systemic indifference on the individual. With Roadwork, it's a piece of paper coming in the mail. It's construction near your house. But it's also the one in Barton Dawes' heart, and it's one that we can all likely relate to. This novel is a deliberate examination of depression and grief, while simultaneously being about everyone's favorite topic, the 1973 energy crisis and urban development. I'm not going to spend too much time exploring Richard Bachman as a pseudonym, because this is my third Bachman review, and you, as a viewer, probably know enough about him not to warrant continued examination. However, for those not in the know, King adopted the pseudonym to publish earlier novels that had been rejected, and to test if his success was purely a result of his brand name. The Bachman books, they share a nihilistic DNA. You can track it from Rage through The Running Man. They rarely end happily, and each book has a cynical, hard edge to it. And they all deal with the little man being crushed by the machine. However, The Long Walk and The Running Man, they operate within the framework of science fiction. They have these high concept hooks that you won't find in Roadwork. The Long Walk is a death march for teenage boys, and The Running Man is a televised hunt for a dissident. Roadwork, meanwhile, has a man refusing to move from his home to make way for a highway extension. But the hook shouldn't be mistaken for a lack of story, because it's really about the inability of us as humans to process loss. As a quick aside, I want to address a criticism that I had of Roadwork when I first tried picking it up a couple of years ago. Well, truthfully, I've tried picking up Roadwork a few times, and it's always failed to capture my attention. And it's because Roadwork felt dull. And dullness in literature can be a real failure of writing. But I think it's working here as an aesthetic choice. The monotony is textual. Our protagonist is trapped in this loop of indecision and denial, with King forces us as readers to inhabit that loop. The repetition of days with the circular arguments with his wife and the aimless drives. These are designed to induce a sense of claustrophobia that mirrors Dawes' mental state. If Dawes immediately began blowing up bulldozers in chapter 2, it would betray its psychological realism. It's not a cinematic montage. It's a slow grinding process of erosion. The slowness or dullness is kind of the point of the novel. It's the excruciating passage of time when one is waiting for the end of the world. Early in the novel, King establishes that Dawes's mind has a protective mechanism, and when it comes to the reality of his situation, a circuit breaker in his head trips. He kept doing things without letting himself think about them. Safer that way. It was like having a circuit breaker in his head, and it thumped into place every time part of him tried to ask, "But why are you doing this?" Part of his mind would go dark. "Hey, Georgie, who turned out the lights?" "Whoops, I did. Something screwy in the wiring, I guess. Just a sec. Reset the switch. The lights go back on." But the thought is gone. Everything is fine. Let us continue, Freddy. Where were we? This metaphor is the key to the novel's structure. The narrative stalls because Dawes is stalling. He's in a state of disassociation. Again, the largest issue is that this novel is billed as a thriller. Protagonists in thrillers often act to change their situation, but Dawes ignores his. He pretty much wages a campaign of aggressive passivity. He's not out there looking for a house. He's not signing the papers, or he's not telling his wife the truth. Roadwork is basically an anti-thriller. His psychological mechanism dictates the narrative flow. The boring scenes where Dawes stares at the television or engages in trivial conversation are textual representations of the darkness caused by the circuit breaker in his mind. He's operating on autopilot to avoid the agony underneath. And that's what makes Roadwork interesting. It's an examination of depression and repression. And just think about it in those terms. The novel is filled with repetitive behaviors. We have Dawes visiting the same locations, listening to the same music, and engaging in the same arguments. It's a repetition of being stuck. His reaction to the destruction of his life is often a strange, detached calm that is then punctuated by bursts of irrational rage. This apathy can make the novel difficult to read because Dawes doesn't drive the plot in a conventional way. Instead, the plot is happening to him. And the slog that people often criticize the novel for, it's all intentional. If any of you have gone through grief, you'll know that it's often a slog. It's heavy and unglamorous. By refusing to speed up the narrative, King forces the reader to acknowledge the weight of Dawes' grief. We're essentially denied the release of action until Dawes himself breaks. And more than anything else in the novel, grief is the true antagonist. Dawes' refusal to move is the central conflict, but it really doesn't make sense when viewed purely as a property dispute. He's being offered more than fair market value, and he has the resources to make the change. But his refusal is more than stubbornness. The house is a physical reminder that his son Charlie existed. We're told that Charlie died of a cancerous brain tumor 3 years before the novel's start, and the text reveals that Dawes never really processed this loss. The house represents this. King spends pages describing the physical details of the house, like the crack in the wall, the height chart in the hallway, or the specific quality of light in Charlie's room. To Dawes, destroying the house represents a second death for Charlie. These objects are sacred. Once they're gone, the physical representation of Charlie's life is gone. The entire conflict of the novel is a desperate attempt to keep his son's memory alive. And this is exasperated further during Dawes' unhinged internal monologues between George and Fred. George is Barton Dawes' middle name, while Fred was Charlie's middle name. The conversations between the two are a continuation of a game they had when Charlie was still alive, where they'd use their middle names as terms of endearment. Throughout these conversations, you discover that George is the primal side that is driven by instincts, while Fred is the moral compass that acts as the internal judge against George's urges. As the novel progresses, the dialogue between them shifts. The chaotic George voice slowly drowns out the rational Fred voice. It's as if Dawes' mind is tearing itself apart, and the disintegration of the internal dialogue it's all part of the tragedy. And finally, we also have the personal context for King. Only a year or so before he wrote Roadwork, King watched his mother die of cancer. The descriptions of Charlie's suffering, they're drawn from King's immediate experience with his mother. In a previous version of the book, King wrote an introduction in which he said that when Roadwork was written, he was grieving and shaken by the apparent senselessness of it, and that Roadwork was him trying to find some answers to the conundrum of human pain. To me, Roadwork is an attempt to articulate the hollowness that follows the death of a loved one, and just how painful living with that can be. By the close of the novel, his wife has left him. He's done deals with the mob, and he's blown up construction machinery with homemade Molotov cocktails. He finishes in a standoff with the police and the media, steadfast in his refusal to give up his house and his life and his son's memories. It's trauma and it's grief, and it's all laid bare for us as readers. So Roadwork is situated in the winter of 1973 and 1974, and this is by specific design. The United States in 1973 was undergoing what amounts to a nervous breakdown. The post-World War II economic boom had slammed into the wall of the OPEC oil embargo. Now, for those of you who don't know about the OPEC oil embargo, and unless you lived through that era or you're producing a video essay on a book that takes place during that time, why would you? Arab OPEC nations initiated the embargo as a direct response against nations that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The United States was one such country. Now, politics aside, this led to gas prices skyrocketing, with lines forming at the pumps. It also coincided with a stock market crash and the Watergate scandal.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Understandably, sentiment around this time, it was pretty damn low. Dawes is an avatar for the American man of this era. Like us millennials, he was promised a future of unlimited growth and the American dream. And then suddenly, the lights were flickering. You can see this in the novel through its obsession with entropy and things breaking down. Everything from the laundry machines and the family car to marriage and country. Even Dawes' body is succumbing to a literal and metaphorical energy crisis. Dawes just flat out runs out of energy. You can see this disillusionment in the man on the street interview that opens the book. It perfectly captures the cynicism of the time. Dawes' rant against the highway is a rant against a system that no longer works. When the young reporter asks Dawes his opinion of the highway extension, Dawes responds, "I think it's a piece of shit." And I mean, you can't really argue with that. I mentioned earlier that grief was the true antagonist of the novel, and I stand by that. But the interstate highway system is a strong secondary antagonist. Now, historically, the construction of highways in the 60s and 70s, it was a violent act of urban planning. It frequently targeted vulnerable communities and destroyed neighborhoods just to facilitate suburban commuting. While Dawes is white and middle class, and thus privileged compared to the minority communities often targeted by such developments, he experiences this infrastructure project as a personal violation. He quickly discovers that he's just a number, and the highway doesn't care about his grief. It's a machine of pure capitalism, driven by growth for its own sake. The roadwork of the title is a double entendre. It refers to the physical construction, but also to the work Dawes must do to navigate the road in his life, which, as we know, he's struggling to navigate. As we near the end of this video, how exactly should we feel about Dawes? Is he an anti-hero of sorts? Maybe the villain? In the pantheon of King's fathers, people probably won't recognize Dawes, but he shares a lot in common with some of King's most famous characters, notably Jack Torrance from The Shining and Lou Creed from Pet Sematary. All three men are unraveling under pressure, dealing with familial failure and the burden of the past. Looking at Dawes and Torrance first, Dawes is in many ways the anti-Torrance. Jack turns against his family to save himself and his career. Dawes, meanwhile, he destroys himself and his career, pushing his family away to save them. It essentially boils down to externalized rage versus internalized rage. Dawes drives his wife away with cruelty, but not because he hates her. Rather, he does it because he knows he's going to die, and he wants her to be clear of the blast radius. He's a pathetic figure, but a deeply selfless one in a weird, twisted way. He creates this villainous persona to liberate his wife and then preserve the memory of his son. Similarly, Dawes and Creed, they feel like extensions of one another. Look at how far grief drives them. They do unthinkable things out of trauma and loss. Both men essentially self-destruct with the death of their sons. First Charlie and then Gage. Sure, their catalyst of madness is different. Creed's is supernatural and Dawes is bureaucratic. But it feels to me, if given the option, Dawes would have brought Charlie to the Micmac burial ground. And let's address the racist, sexist elephant in the room. Dawes is rightfully criticized for his slurs and how he objectifies women. But we have to contextualize the unlikability. King is writing Dawes with a specific archetype in mind. The frustrated, middle-aged white man in 1973. Dawes is a portrait of the silent majority voter who's cracking up. His casual racism is an inherent part of his character. He's a man who feels the world is leaving him behind. And honestly, given today's political climate, he's an archetype that remains. And Dawes is something of a dinosaur in many ways. The highway represents the future, and Dawes, he represents the past. The future is integrated and fast and impersonal. The past is insular and prejudiced and static. His destruction is inevitable because he refuses to adapt. The ugliness of his character is necessary to show why he can't survive in the new world. So, what is the answer to how we should view him? It's complicated. Roadwork takes its atmospheric cues from the Rolling Stones album Let It Bleed, which Dawes listens to obsessively. It's a novel that lets the wound of grief bleed freely, without bandaging it with happy endings or supernatural explanations. I'm not going to argue that the book is fun. It really isn't. But it does feel true in its depiction of how life falls apart after direct loss. The world continues to move, whether we're prepared to accept it or not. I don't look at Roadwork as a failed novel. It feels more like a courageous experiment in asking the reader to stare into the void of a pointless loss and then work your way out of it. It's a novel about the roadwork of the soul. And for Barton Dawes, that road is closed. For those following along with this video series, I've been trying to highlight connections between King novels as I read them. So, starting with this video and going forward, I'm going to update this corkboard whenever we have a connection. Or whenever I think of one. And I don't mean a connection as in direct sequels. Obviously, there's a connection between The Shining and Dr. Sleep. Now, interestingly, for a Bachman book, there's a connection to two of King's works. The first is the Blue Ribbon Laundry that Barton runs. It shares a name with the one where Carrie's mother works. Then, at the laundry, we have The Mangler, from the night shift story of the same name. Now, given the differences in locations, they're not the same laundry, but they share the fact that bad stuff happens to those who associate with them. And that's it for today's video. As always, I appreciate you joining me here at Mysterious Galaxies. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, family, and even your enemies. Just please, nobody at the Texas Department of Transportation. I already have a highway I consider too close to my house, and I don't need an extension. And of course, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button because every subscriber inches me one step closer to taking over the Galaxies. Until next time, take care, keep reading, and I'll see you in the next one.